This abomination, she began, the word hissing through teeth that seemed a little too white and a little too perfectly aligned for a woman of her vintage. It has to go. Her name was Carol, and she was pointing a trembling, manicured finger at my fire pit. I was on my own property, a good 20 feet from the invisible line that separated my 5 acres of woods and water from the neatly manicured, beige-sided kingdom she ruled as president of the Oak Creek Homeowners Association. I had been enjoying the quiet gurgle of the spring-fed creek that bisected my land, a mug of coffee growing cold in my hand, when her voice had sliced through the morning peace like a serrated knife. "Good morning, Carol," I said, my voice deliberately calm. I didn't stand up from the large, flat-top boulder I was using as a bench. It was part of the natural landscape, and I had a policy of not surrendering high ground without a tactical reason. "Do not good morning me, Colonel," she spat, using my retired rank like an epithet. "This is an unacceptable fire hazard and a clear violation. It is an unapproved structure." She was a woman built of sharp angles and simmering rage, clad in a pastel pink tracksuit that did nothing to soften her edges. A matching visor was pulled down low, casting a shadow over eyes that seemed to be in a perpetual state of accusatory squinting. I took a slow sip of my coffee and looked from her taut face to the object of her ire. It was a fire pit, yes, but to call it a mere structure was a disservice. I had spent the better part of a month building it, not with concrete and rebar, but by carefully selecting and placing stones from my own property. It was nestled in a natural clearing, built on a base of solid bedrock I'd painstakingly exposed. The pit itself was deep, lined with fire brick I'd salvaged, and encircled by a 3-foot-wide ring of river stones and gravel. Beyond that was another 10 feet of cleared earth. It was as close to a professionally engineered, fail-safe fire containment system as you could get without a government contract. I should know. I used to sign off on government contracts for things far more complex. "Carol," I said, setting my mug down on the boulder beside me, "this fire pit is over 150 feet from the nearest dwelling, which is my own house. It's more than 75 feet from the nearest tree line. It's built on solid rock, surrounded by non-combustible material, and is adjacent to a running creek. It not only meets, but significantly exceeds every state and county fire code regulation." I had, of course, researched this exhaustively before laying the first stone. That's just how my brain works. Assess, plan, execute. She waved a dismissive hand, the rings on her fingers catching the morning sun. "The HOA bylaws are very clear about unapproved external modifications." "They are," I agreed. "And they are also very clear that their authority ends at the property line markers, which, if you'll notice, are about 20 feet behind you. This is my land. It is not, nor has it ever been, part of the Oak Creek HOA." This was a fact, a legally recorded, indisputable fact. I had made certain of it before I ever signed the deed. My 5 acres were an island of autonomy bordering her meticulously controlled suburban archipelago. A dark flush crept up her neck, clashing violently with the pink of her tracksuit. "The spirit of the community covenants is to maintain a certain aesthetic and safety standard for the entire neighborhood. Your primitive rock pile is an eyesore and a danger to all the dues-paying members who have to look at it." Ah, the spirit of the rules. The last refuge of a tyrant who finds the actual text of the law inconvenient. "It's a danger to no one," I stated flatly. "And with all due respect, the only person who can see it is you, and only if you trespass on my land to do so, which you are currently doing." Her mouth opened and closed, creating a small fish-like popping sound. She was not accustomed to calm, factual resistance. Her usual targets were, I gathered, more easily cowed. "I am the president of this community," she screeched, her voice climbing an octave. "I have a responsibility. I am officially citing you for this violation. You will receive a formal notice. You have 14 days to dismantle this thing and restore the ground to its natural state. If you fail to comply, we will begin fining you $500 a day. We will place a lien on your property. We will see you in court, Colonel." She spun on her heel, her pristine white sneakers crunching on the gravel I'd laid down, and marched back toward her domain. I watched her go, the rigid set of her shoulders radiating indignation. I took another sip of my now lukewarm coffee. The morning peace was shattered, but in its place something else settled over me. It was a feeling I hadn't felt in the 3 years since I'd retired from the Army Corps of Engineers. It was a familiar, cold, and deeply calming sense of purpose. The mission parameters had just been made crystal clear. The enemy had declared her intentions. It was time to prepare the battle space. So, if you've ever had a run-in with a power-tripping HOA board member, a petty tyrant who gets a little too much joy from wielding their tiny gavel, you know the feeling. It's that mix of disbelief and incandescent rage. If you're nodding your head right now, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It helps the channel, and it lets me know I'm not alone in fighting the good fight. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what your own HOA nightmare story is. Misery loves company, after all. Now let me tell you how this all started. For 30 years, I was a colonel in the United States Army Corps of Engineers. My life was a symphony of regulations, blueprints, and logistics. I helped design and oversee the construction of dams that could withstand a 1,000-year flood, airfields built on reclaimed swampland, and infrastructure in places where the local definition of building code was whether or not it fell over in a stiff breeze. I dealt with contractors, congressmen, and colonels from other, less sensible branches of the military. My entire career was about imposing order on chaos, following established protocols, and understanding that rules, when properly written and enforced, create safety and predictability. But after 3 decades, I was tired. I was tired of the bureaucracy, the endless meetings, and the constant pressure. My dream, the one that got me through long nights in temporary command posts and dusty project sites, was simple. Peace. I wanted a piece of land with trees and moving water, a place where the only deadlines were the changing of the seasons, and the only committee meetings were with the local deer population about my vegetable garden. When I retired, I spent 6 months searching for that place. I finally found it in a 5-acre parcel of undeveloped land that was being sold off from a much larger, older farm. It was perfect. A thick stand of mature hardwoods, oak, hickory, and maple, covered most of it. And best of all, a natural Cienega spring bubbled up from an aquifer deep underground, forming a clear, cold creek that ran the length of the property before disappearing back into the earth. It was a small, self-contained ecosystem. The most attractive feature, however, was a legal one. The property was bordered on one side by the Oak Creek development, a sprawling subdivision of identical houses with immaculate, chemically green lawns. The original farmer who sold the land to the developers had been shrewd. He'd carved out this 5-acre piece for himself, ensuring in the deed and covenants that it was explicitly and permanently excluded from the formation of any future homeowners association. It was a sovereign nation of 5 acres. I had my lawyer, a man who once helped me navigate the labyrinthine legalities of building a bridge in a country that technically didn't exist anymore, review the title and deed with a microscope. He confirmed it. The land was untouchable by the HOA. I could paint my house purple, raise llamas, and build a 10-foot-tall gnome in my front yard if I so desired, and there wasn't a thing the Oak Creek HOA could do about it. Not that I planned to. All I wanted was to be left alone. I built a modest but solid house, well back from the property line, nestled in the trees. I spent my days clearing brush, establishing walking trails, and observing the quiet drama of the woods. The spring was the heart of it all. It was my sanctuary. and the fire pit was to be its centerpiece, a place to sit on cool evenings, watch the flames, and listen to the water and the owls. I built it with the same care and precision I'd use to oversee the pouring of a critical bridge pier. Every stone was chosen, every angle calculated for airflow and safety. It was a masterpiece of amateur masonry and professional engineering. I was aware of Carol long before she was aware of me. I'd see her on my trips to the mailbox, which was at the end of my long driveway, where it met the pristine asphalt of her kingdom. She'd be marching the sidewalks, clipboard in hand, peering at flower beds and measuring the height of grass with a stern expression. She ruled Oak Creek with an iron fist, and a three-ring binder full of bylaws she seemed to interpret with the flexible zeal of a televangelist interpreting scripture. I had hoped my legal isolation would make me invisible to her. I was wrong. My quiet enjoyment was, it seemed, an unapproved external modification to her worldview. The day after our Creekside confrontation, the first official salvo arrived. It was delivered not by the mailman, but hand-placed in my mailbox, a violation of federal law, I noted with a dry smile. It was a heavy, cream-colored envelope. The letter inside was on matching cardstock, thick enough to stop a small caliber round, with an ostentatiously embossed Oak Creek HOA logo at the top. The letter was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive legalese, likely drafted by Carol herself after consulting a thesaurus. It cited Bylaw 7, Section 4C, Unapproved Structures and Landscaping Modifications, and Bylaw 12, Section 2A, Actions Detrimental to Community Safety and Aesthetics. It formally demanded the immediate deconstruction and removal of the unpermitted, non-compliant incendiary installation, and levied an initial fine of $500, with a warning of further daily fines and legal action, just as she'd threatened. I read it twice. My first reaction wasn't anger. It was a quiet, professional appreciation for a well-defined problem. This was no longer a disagreement. This was a campaign, and a campaign required a plan. I drove into town. I didn't go to a lawyer's office, not yet. I went to an office supply store. I walked out with a heavy-duty 3-inch D-ring binder, a set of reinforced alphabetical tab dividers, a ream of high-quality paper, and a 3-hole punch. Back home, at the large oak desk in my study, I began the assembly. I printed a cover sheet in a simple, bold, sans serif font. It read, Operation Chimera. I chose the name because a chimera is a mythical fire-breathing monster, which seemed to be how Carol viewed my humble fire pit. It was also, more technically, an organism containing a mixture of genetically different tissues, which felt appropriate for a conflict spanning the boundary between two legally distinct properties. I 3-hole punched Carol's letter. It became the first document placed behind the C tab for communications, hostile. I took a high-resolution photograph of the envelope, clearly showing it had been placed in my mailbox without postage, printed it, punched it, and filed it behind the F tab for federal violations. This is how you win. You don't win with shouting matches over a property line. You don't win by getting angry. You win with documentation. You win with a binder that gets heavier and heavier with your opponent's mistakes. You build a fortress of paper, a citadel of facts, and you wait for them to charge it. My response had to be precise. It had to be calm, factual, and utterly devoid of emotion. It also had to establish a clear, unambiguous legal record that I had acted in good faith. I drafted a letter. It was polite, but firm. I began by acknowledging receipt of her correspondence. I then methodically dismantled her position, point by point, citing evidence as if I were writing an after-action report. Regarding your citation under Bylaw 7, I wrote, I must respectfully reiterate that my property, as defined by County Parcel ID number 734-B2, is not and has never been subject to the covenants, bylaws, or authority of the Oak Creek Homeowners Association. I have attached a copy of the relevant section of my property deed and the official county plot map for your reference. Regarding your citation under Bylaw 12, I continued, the fire pit in question was constructed in full compliance with all applicable state and county fire safety regulations. For your convenience, I have attached a copy of the County Fire Code, Section 4, Open Burning and Recreational Fires, with the relevant passages highlighted. You will note my construction exceeds these minimum safety standards in every respect. I concluded the letter with a simple, firm statement. As this matter pertains to a legally separate property over which you have no jurisdiction, I consider this issue closed. I will not be dismantling the fire pit, nor will I be paying the baseless fine. Any further communication on this matter that includes threats of fines or legal action against my legally held property will be forwarded to my legal counsel. I printed the letter and the attachments, the deed, the county plot map, the fire code. I made a complete copy of the entire package. The copy went into my binder behind the R tab for responses. The original went into a large envelope. The next morning I drove to the post office. I sent the letter via certified mail with return receipt requested. This was critical. It would provide me with a legal document signed by Carol or another agent of the HOA, proving they had received my rebuttal. It's the paper trail equivalent of a direct, confirmed hit. The green certified mail slip and the eventual signed receipt card would, of course, be 3-hole punched and filed in the binder. The cost was $12.55. It was the best money I'd ever spent. I expected a grudging retreat, a quiet, face-saving cessation of hostilities. I had, after all, presented her with irrefutable facts and legal documents. I had shown her that her guns were pointed at a sovereign nation. What I got, a week later, was a declaration of total war. The second letter also arrived by hand, another federal offense I dutifully photographed. This one was not on the stately cream cardstock. It was on bright, angry red paper. The text was in a larger font, with certain phrases bolded, underlined, and in some cases, both. Your refusal to comply is unacceptable, it shrieked from the page. Your documents are irrelevant. The Oak Creek HOA board has a fiduciary duty to protect the community from all threats, regardless of arbitrary property lines. Your fire pit is a blatant public nuisance. It went on to inform me that my initial fine had now doubled to $1,000, and the daily $500 fines had commenced. It included a blurry photograph of my fire pit, likely taken by Carol herself from the edge of my property, as evidence. I read the letter with a growing sense of grim satisfaction. This was a classic tactical error. She had ignored my evidence, rejected my good faith attempt at de-escalation, and doubled down on a legally indefensible position. She was emotional, irrational, and arrogant. She was, in short, the perfect adversary. I punched the red letter and its envelope and filed them neatly behind the first one in the hostile communications section. The binder was getting heavier. It was time to move to the next phase of the operation, reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. The binder was my defensive fortification. Now I needed to build my arsenal for the counteroffensive. My first objective was to move beyond local ordinance and into higher law. HOA bylaws are the lowest form of legal authority, easily superseded by county, state, and federal law. Carol was operating under the delusion that her binder of rules was the supreme law of the land. I was going to introduce her to the concept of a higher command structure. I spent the next 2 weeks in my study, which I now refer to internally as the Command Operations Center. I dove into state environmental codes, federal water rights acts, and property law precedents. My engineering background made the dense legal language easier to parse. It was all just a system, a set of rules and dependencies. You just had to find the load-bearing walls. And then I found it. The legal smoking gun. It was a state environmental statute passed a decade earlier to protect the state's dwindling wetlands. It was titled the Aquifer and Springhead Protection Act. The language was unequivocal. It stated that any natural springhead and the first 100 feet of its downstream waterway was a protected ecological area. Any action by any entity, individual, corporate, or municipal that could alter, impede, or introduce pollutants into that protected zone was strictly illegal without a complex and expensive permit from the State Department of Environmental Protection. The fines for violating the act started at $10,000 per day. My fire pit wasn't just on my property. My fire pit was built adjacent to a legally protected wetland. Carol wasn't just demanding I remove a structure. She was demanding I perform an act that would require heavy equipment, or at the very least, significant ground disturbance within the protected zone of a Cienega spring. Her demand wasn't just wrong. It was a demand that I commit a serious environmental crime. I printed out the entire text of the Aquifer and Springhead Protection Act, all 27 pages of it. I highlighted the relevant sections. I three-hole punched it and placed it in the binder under a new tab. L for legal preeminence. A wide, predatory grin spread across my face. This was better than a smoking gun. This was a fully armed predator drone circling her position. The next morning, I made a phone call. I didn't call my lawyer. I called the main enforcement office of the State Department of Environmental Protection. I navigated their phone tree and finally got a human being on the line, a man named Frank who sounded weary and overworked. I calmly and methodically explained the situation. I gave him my property's parcel ID. I described the spring. I explained the HOA's demand that I dismantle a stone structure adjacent to it and restore the ground to its natural state. I didn't mention Carol or her attitude. I just laid out the facts. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the clicking of a keyboard. "Let me get this straight, Colonel," Frank said, his voice no longer weary but sharp with interest. "You have a Cienega spring on your property, which is great, they're getting rare. And the HOA for the subdivision next door is ordering you, in writing, to perform what amounts to unpermitted excavation work within its protected buffer zone?" "That is correct," I said. "And do they cite a reason?" "They claim my stone fire pit is a fire code violation and an aesthetic nuisance." I heard a sound that might have been a snort, quickly suppressed. "Sir, for the record, this agency is not concerned with aesthetics, but we are very, very concerned with the integrity of the state's protected waterways. An HOA has absolutely zero authority to compel a landowner to violate state environmental law. In fact, them doing so is, well, it's a new one for me, but it's profoundly illegal." "That was my assessment as well," I said. "I'm opening a case file right now," Frank said, his voice all business. "This is case file E P-2023-714. I'm sending a certified letter to the Oak Creek HOA's registered address, informing them that the area in question is under DEP protection, and that any attempt to enforce their demands will be met with the full force of this department. We don't mess around, Colonel. The fines are severe, and we can pursue criminal charges against the officers of the board if they knowingly persist." He had just turned my predator drone into an entire squadron. "Thank you, Frank," I said. "I appreciate your time." "No, thank you," he replied. "This is the most interesting thing to happen all week. Good luck, sir." I hung up the phone. I wrote down the case number, the date, and Frank's name on a fresh sheet of paper. I filed it under A for Allies, Governmental. The binder was now thick and heavy. It felt powerful in my hands. But I wasn't done. Carol had declared war on me, but her letter had mentioned the HOA board. She had cronies, and she had victims. A good field commander knows the terrain, and that includes the human terrain. It was time to build a local resistance. I started taking walks, not on my property, but through the streets of Oak Creek. I was always polite, always waved. I started talking to people who were out gardening or washing their cars. I never brought up the HOA. I just made small talk. About the weather, about the local sports team. After a few weeks, people started opening up. It started with a man named George, a retired postal worker who was meticulously tending his rose bushes. I complimented them, and he launched into a quiet, bitter tirade. Carol had fined him $200 because his garden gnome, a cherished gift from his granddaughter, was not in harmony with the approved landscape palette. He had to move it to his back patio where no one could see it. A few days later, I spoke with a young mother named Susan who was pushing her toddler on a swing set. She told me she'd received a violation notice because her bird feeder was attracting undesirable avian elements, and the scattered seed was unsightly. The stories were all the same: petty, vindictive, and arbitrary enforcement of vaguely worded rules. Carol was a bully who got her power from the fear and isolation of her residents. They were all fighting their own small, losing battles. They had no idea they were part of a larger pattern. I listened patiently to each story. I would end each conversation the same way. "That sounds incredibly frustrating," I'd say. "You know, if you ever wanted to formally dispute that, you'd want to have all your documentation in order. The letters she sent you, any pictures you have, just in case." I was planting seeds. I was teaching them indirectly the importance of building their own binders. My counteroffensive was now planned. I had a legal fortress built on property law, a governmental air force in the form of the DEP, and a burgeoning ground insurgency within the enemy's own territory. All that was left was to bait the trap and wait for the enemy to make a fatal mistake. I didn't have to wait long. The next logical step in my campaign plan was to engage legal firepower. While I was confident in my research, a civilian conflict zone requires a different kind of expert than a military one. I needed a lawyer, but not just any lawyer. I needed a fellow warrior. I called Marcus "Gunny" Davis. Gunny was a retired Marine Master Gunnery Sergeant who had, late in his career, gone to law school on the Corps' dime. He was now a private attorney with a reputation for being a shark in a tailored suit. He specialized in civil litigation and had a particular fondness for cases involving arrogant bullies overstepping their authority. We had worked together once on a joint service project, and I knew his mind was as sharp and unforgiving as a bayonet. I met him at his office. It was Spartan and organized, a wall of legal books on one side and a framed photo of him and his platoon in Fallujah on the other. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I placed Operation Chimera on his polished mahogany desk. It landed with a solid, satisfying thud. "What's this, Colonel?" he asked, a slight smile playing on his lips. "Your memoirs?" "Opposition research, field prepped," I replied. "I have a situation with a local homeowners association." For the next hour, I walked him through it. I started with the in-person confrontation and proceeded chronologically, using the binder's tabs to guide the narrative. I showed him the hostile communications, my certified mail receipts, the property deeds, the county fire codes, the highlighted Aquifer and Springhead Protection Act, and my notes from the call with the DEP, including the case number. Gunny was silent throughout my presentation. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers, his eyes narrowed in concentration. He occasionally nodded, and when I got to the part about the DEP, that slight smile returned, wider this time. When I was finished, he leaned forward, placed his hands on the open binder, and reverently turned a few pages. "Colonel," he said, his voice laced with genuine admiration, "this isn't a case file. This is a kill box. It's beautiful. You've documented every misstep, established a perfect paper trail, and backed her into a corner where every possible move she makes is illegal in a new and exciting way. So you'll take the case?" "Take the case?" He chuckled, a low rumbling sound. "I'll pay you to let me take this case. This is a prosecutor's dream. We're not going to just defend you, Colonel. We're going to dismantle her. He closed the binder and looked at me. So, what's our next move? We send her a cease and desist letter that will make her hair curl. We inform her that she and the board are now on notice for tortious interference, harassment, and attempting to compel the violation of state law. No, I said calmly. Not yet. A good commander never interrupts his enemy when they are in the middle of making a mistake. She's arrogant and emotional. She believes she's untouchable. Right now, all she has done is send nasty letters. I want her to escalate. I want her to do something physical, something undeniable, something I can get on camera. Gunny's smile turned feral. You want to give her more rope. I want to give her enough rope to stage a public hanging. Carol did not disappoint. 2 weeks after Gunny and I met, the letter from the DEP arrived at the HOA's mailing address. I know this because a copy was sent to me as the reporting party. It was a brutal, 2-page document written in merciless legalese. It informed the board of the spring's protected status, quoted the relevant statutes and penalties, and warned them in no uncertain terms to cease and desist all efforts to compel me to disturb the area. I filed it in my binder under A for Allies. I expected this to be the final nail in the coffin of her crusade. A direct order from a state-level agency with the power to levy crippling fines should have been enough to make even the most fanatical tyrant stand down. But Carol was not just a tyrant, she was an idiot. 1 week later, on a bright Tuesday morning, I heard the rumble of a heavy diesel engine coming down my driveway. I went to the window. It was a large, flatbed truck from Pristine Lawns and Landscaping, a company I'd seen working around the subdivision. On the back of the truck was a small Bobcat excavator. My heart didn't race. It settled into a slow, steady, powerful rhythm. The moment had arrived. I grabbed 3 things: my phone, a portable battery bank to ensure it wouldn't die, and a clipboard. On the clipboard, I placed a copy of the county plot map showing my property lines, a copy of the first page of the DEP letter with the case number clearly visible, and a printed notice stating, all activities on this property are being recorded by video and audio. I walked outside and started recording on my phone before I was even fully visible. I positioned myself at the point where my driveway met the path to the creek, a clear choke point. The truck lumbered to a halt. A man in a sweat-stained shirt and a baseball cap hopped out. He looked to be the foreman. Morning, he said, a bit uncertainly. Got a work order here to dismantle a stone fire pit and level the area. This the right place? Good morning, I said, my voice pleasant and calm. I held up my phone so the camera was obviously pointed at him. Who issued that work order? He squinted at me, then at the phone. The HOA, lady named Carol, the president. I see, I said. Well, I have some information for you that you're going to find very important. First, you are currently on private property. The property you are on is not part of the Oak Creek HOA. I held up the clipboard and pointed to the map. As you can see from the official county survey, the HOA's jurisdiction ends about 200 feet behind you. The foreman's eyes widened slightly. He looked from the map back to me. Second, I continued, flipping to the next page, the area you have been ordered to work in is a protected wetland under the authority of the State Department of Environmental Protection. This is a letter from them, and this is the active case file number. The work you've been hired to do is illegal under the Aquifer and Springhead Protection Act and carries a minimum $10,000 per day fine for any party involved in its execution. That would include you and your company. The color drained from the foreman's face. He was a landscaper, not a lawyer, but he understood the words $10,000 per day fine. Finally, I said, pointing the clipboard at the third sheet with its bold lettering, I need to inform you that this entire conversation, your presence here, your vehicle, and your equipment are all being recorded as evidence. Continuing any further will be considered willful criminal trespass, and conspiracy to violate state environmental law. The foreman took a step back. He looked at his truck, at the Bobcat, and then at me, standing there calmly with my phone and my clipboard of doom. He looked like a man who just realized he'd been sent to disarm a bomb with a pair of garden shears. She told us it was all approved, he stammered. She said it was community property. She was mistaken, I said simply. I suggest you call your boss. I also suggest you remove yourself and your equipment from my property immediately. He fumbled for his own phone and made a frantic call. I couldn't hear the other end, but his side of the conversation was short and panicked. No, boss, you don't understand. State DEP. He's got a case number. Yeah, he's filming everything. 10 grand a day. No, I'm not kidding. He hung up the phone. We're leaving, he said, not looking me in the eye. Sorry for the trouble. He and his driver hopped back in the truck, executed a clumsy three-point turn in my driveway, and rumbled away, leaving behind only the smell of diesel fumes and Carol's spectacular failure. I stopped recording. I saved the video file to my computer, then uploaded a copy to a secure cloud server. I printed out a screenshot of the truck on my property and a transcript of the conversation. I three-hole punched them both and filed them under a new tab in the binder. E for evidence, direct. This was the critical error I had been waiting for. She hadn't just made threats, she had acted. She had hired a third party to illegally enter my property and commit a crime on her behalf. This was no longer just harassment. This was conspiracy. It was time to galvanize the rebellion. That evening, I edited the video. I cut it down to the essential 2 minutes. The truck's arrival, the foreman stating he was there on Carol's orders, and my calm, evidence-based dismantling of his mission. I added subtitles for clarity. Then I sent a simple email to George, the gnome owner, Susan, the bird feeder mom, and a half-dozen other residents who had shared their stories with me. The subject line was, Information regarding the Oak Creek HOA board. The body of the email was simple. I believe the attached video may be relevant to your interests. It documents an attempt by the HOA president to use community funds to hire a contractor to perform illegal work on private property. I believe a pattern of misconduct is now clearly established. Perhaps it's time we all had a chat. The response was instantaneous and electric. Their fear, which had kept them isolated and compliant, had been burned away by the clear, undeniable evidence of Carol's overreach. Outrage took its place. An impromptu meeting was called for the following evening in George's garage, surrounded by his forbidden gnomes. But the final piece of intelligence, the one that would serve as the kill shot, came from an unexpected source. The day after I sent the video, I received an anonymous email. It contained a single, password-protected file and a short message. I was the board treasurer for 6 months last year. I quit because I couldn't stand her bullying and the shady bookkeeping. The password is, no more gnomes. Do what you will with this. A friend. I opened the file. It was a complete dump of the HOA's financial records for the past 18 months. Bank statements, invoices, checks, it was all there. I spent the next 4 hours poring over the documents. What I found was staggering. Carol wasn't just a bully, she was a crook. She was using the HOA debit card for personal expenses, expensive dinners, salon appointments, online shopping. She had hired pristine lawns and landscaping, the same company she'd sent to my property, to do extensive work on her own private yard, paid for out of the HOA's Community Beautification Fund. She had paid thousands to a law firm for consulting fees that lined up perfectly with her initial threats against me and other residents. She was using the community's money to finance her personal kingdom and her private wars. I printed every single damning invoice and bank statement. I highlighted every questionable charge. The stack of paper was an inch thick. I three-hole punched every single sheet. The binder could barely close. Operation Chimera was complete. All that was left was the public coup. The emergency HOA meeting was called for the following Thursday. The official reason, stated in the notice Carol sent out, was to discuss urgent security matters and necessary bylaw enforcement actions. Her thinly veiled euphemism for the kernel problem. Unbeknownst to her, we had used our own quiet network to ensure a massive turnout. The community center meeting room, a soulless space with beige walls and flickering fluorescent lights, was packed. Every one of the 150 households in Oak Creek seemed to be represented. The air was thick with stale coffee and a palpable sense of tension. Carol and her two cronies on the board, a milquetoast man named Barry, and a woman who looked permanently startled named Elaine, sat at a folding table at the front of the room. Carol, radiating smug authority, banged a small gavel. "Welcome, everyone," she began, her voice dripping with condescension. "I'm so glad to see so many of you taking your community obligations seriously. We have a grave matter to discuss. There is a homeowner," she paused for dramatic effect, though she didn't use my name, "on the border of our beautiful community who has refused to comply with basic safety and aesthetic standards. He has constructed a dangerous, unapproved structure and has responded to our polite requests with hostility and legal threats." She was actually trying to frame me as the aggressor. The audacity was breathtaking. "The board has voted to take all necessary actions," she continued, "including levying significant fines and pursuing a lawsuit to force compliance. This will, unfortunately, require a special assessment on all homeowners to cover the legal fees, but protecting our property values is paramount." A murmur went through the crowd. She was going to make them pay for her private vendetta. This was our opening. As planned, George stood up. He was a nervous man, but his voice was steady. "Carol, before we talk about a special assessment, I have a question about the board's current spending." Carol's eyes narrowed. "This isn't the time for financial questions, George. This is about a security threat." "I think it's relevant," George insisted, emboldened by the supportive faces around him. "For example, I was wondering what community beautification project cost $1,200 at Pristine Lawns and Landscaping on May 17th. Carol's face went rigid. "That was for tree trimming in the common area." "That's funny," George said, holding up a piece of paper, "because I have a copy of an invoice here for that exact amount, for the installation of a new sprinkler system and sod at your home address, Carol, paid for by the HOA." The room erupted in gasps and angry whispers. Before Carol could respond, Susan, the bird feeder mom, stood up. "And I'd like to know about the $2,000 in legal consulting fees paid last month. Was that related to the official warning the board received from the State Department of Environmental Protection regarding your harassment of a private landowner?" Carol's face had gone from smug to pale to a blotchy, furious red. "That is confidential board business," she shrieked, banging her gavel. "You are out of order." "I don't think I am," Susan said, her voice ringing with newfound confidence. "Because ordering a contractor to commit a crime that would have resulted in tens of thousands of dollars in fines for this HOA isn't confidential business. It's gross negligence and malfeasance." The room was in an uproar now. People were yelling, demanding answers. Carol was banging her gavel repeatedly, the sharp cracks lost in the growing din. This was my cue. I walked to the front of the room, carrying a laptop and a small projector. Gunny, who had been sitting quietly in the back, followed me. "If I may," I said, my voice cutting through the noise. I didn't need to shout. Decades of command presence does that for you. The room quieted, all eyes on me. I set up the projector and aimed it at the blank wall behind the board's table. The first image that appeared was the crystal-clear county plot map, with my property outlined in red and the Oak Creek HOA in blue. My name is Colonel Frank Miller, retired. I am the homeowner in question. This, I said, pointing to the map, is the legal reality. My property is not and has never been part of this HOA. For the last 2 months, your board president has been engaged in a campaign of illegal harassment and intimidation against me. I clicked to the next slide. It was a photo of her first threatening letter. Then the next, my certified mail receipt. I walked them through the entire campaign, document by document. When I put up the letter from the DEP, a collective gasp went through the room. Then I played the video. The sight of the landscaping truck on my property, the foreman admitting he was sent by Carol, and the mention of the $10,000 a day fine, all playing out on the wall in high definition, was devastating. This action, I said, pausing the video on a clear shot of the truck, was not only illegal, but it exposed every single member of this HOA to massive financial liability. If that foreman had started that excavator, your dues would be paying off state environmental fines for the next decade. Carol was sputtering, a torrent of denials and accusations pouring from her lips. He's lying. The documents are fake. He's a menace. But no one was listening to her. They were all looking at the final slide I put up. It was a summary of the financial records leaked by the former treasurer. A simple, brutal spreadsheet showing over $15,000 of HOA funds misappropriated for personal use or to fund Carol's illegal vendetta. "This is embezzlement," Gunny said, stepping forward. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of law. "And I can assure you these documents are very real. I've already forwarded them, along with a copy of everything you've seen here tonight, to the district attorney's office. An official investigation is pending." That was the final blow. The room fell into a dead, stunned silence. Carol stared at Gunny, her mouth hanging open, all the fight gone out of her. Her cronies, Barry and Elaine, looked like they wanted the floor to swallow them whole. They seemed to shrink into their chairs, trying to become invisible. George stood up again, his voice booming with a confidence I'd never heard from him. "I make a motion for a vote of no confidence in the entire current board, effective immediately." "Seconded," yelled a dozen voices at once. "All in favor," George shouted. A deafening roar of "Aye!" shook the room. It was a unanimous, primal scream of liberation. All opposed? Silence. Utter, complete silence. Carol just sat there, her face a mask of disbelief and ruin. "The motion carries," George said, his voice thick with emotion. "Carol, you and your board are removed." For a long moment, she didn't move. Then slowly she pushed her chair back, stood up, and without a word she turned and fled the room. She didn't walk, she ran, a disgraced tyrant escaping the judgment of her own people. The humiliation was total. The aftermath was swift and decisive. In the vacuum of power left by Carol's spectacular implosion, a new regime was born. That very night, an interim board was elected by a unanimous show of hands. George, the once timid gnome enthusiast, was named the new president. His first official act was to propose a motion to void every single fine levied by Carol's board in the past year. It passed with a thunderous ovation. His second act was to formally and publicly apologize to me on behalf of the entire community. The following weeks saw the full reckoning. The district attorney's office did in fact launch a criminal investigation into the embezzlement. Faced with the mountain of evidence Gunny had provided, Carol was charged with multiple counts of fraud and theft. The HOA, under George's new leadership, also filed a civil suit against her to recover the misappropriated funds, including the thousands she had wasted on lawyers to pursue her vendetta against me. The legal and financial pressure was immense. Her husband, who was apparently as clueless about her financial crimes as he was about her tyrannical nature, left her. Within 6 months, a "for sale" sign appeared on her immaculate lawn. The sale of the house barely covered her legal fees and the restitution she was ordered to pay to the HOA. She left the community broken, disgraced, and financially ruined. A petty queen deposed from her cardboard castle. The change in the neighborhood was almost immediate. It was like a cloud had lifted. People started talking to each other again. Bird feeders appeared in yards. George's gnome was returned to its place of honor among the rose bushes. The atmosphere of fear was replaced by one of cooperation and genuine community. They even threw a neighborhood block party, and I was the guest of honor. I brought a salad. It felt good. Now I'm sitting where this all began. On the large, flat boulder beside my fire pit, a small, clean fire is crackling in the stone circle, its warmth pushing back the evening chill. The smoke curls straight up into the starry sky. The only sound is the fire, the gentle murmur of the protected spring-fed creek, and the distant call of an owl. The binder, Operation Chimera, sits on the shelf in my study. It's a testament to the fact that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't a weapon at all, but a three-hole punch and a relentless dedication to the truth. It's a reminder that the loudest, most aggressive person in the room is often standing on the weakest foundation. I didn't seek this fight. I came here for peace, and for a while, I had to go to war to secure it. But as I sit here, watching the embers glow and feeling the profound, unbroken quiet of my own land, I know that I have it now. This is the peace I worked my whole life for. And I learned that the best way to deal with a petty tyrant isn't to stoop to their level. It's to build a case so solid, so factual, and so overwhelmingly documented that their world simply crumbles under its weight. It's not about revenge, it's about restoring order. And finally, there is order. There is peace.